In an earlier class, we learned how to create a list of numbers by using the range function. We can also create our own functions if we find that we are reusing this same piece of script over and over. So let's try creating our own function in Python. In a new Dynamo file, go ahead and place a new Python script node. To understand functions, let's start with something simple, a function that simply returns a number. To create the function, we start with the keyword def, which is short for defined, followed by a unique name, so it doesn't conflict with any other names in Python. Let's call it my function. We then put a set of parentheses. Between these parentheses, we can put parameters for the function, but let's keep this one simple, so we'll just use an open and close parentheses, followed by a colon as it's a statement. Any code that we want to be part of this function needs to be written within the indented space after the colon, the same as statements like if, else, or a for loop. To return data from our function, we need to use the keyword return. Let's try this by simply returning the number 13. By itself, our new function doesn't really do anything. To use it, we need to call it as we would any other function. So let's try this by outputting a call to my function directly to the out variable. And don't forget the 2 round brackets as it's a function. Then go ahead and hit run. Great, so you can see that our first function has returned the value 13. Now that we know the basic syntax of the function, let's try something a little bit more complicated. Let's create a function that takes a number and creates a set of circles in the x direction equaling that number, like the range function, but for circles. So go ahead and let's define a new function and we'll call it circle range. This time inside of the parentheses, let's add a parameter which will be used when we call the function. To do this, we simply put a variable name inside of the parentheses. We can then use this variable within our function. Let's call it num. We can make this a default number. To do this, we use the equal symbol, then the default value, for example 5. So when we call the function, if a parameter isn't provided, that is a number, 5 will be the default. Don't forget to add a colon, and then let's add in our code on the next line. To start, we want to catch if someone uses 0 or 1 as a parameter, as it's a good habit to account for errors that may occur when calling your function. So if this is the case, we just want to output a string. To do this, let's check if num is less than 2. If this is true, let's simply return number needs to be higher. If this returns false, let's use an else statement, and inside of this, we'll create a list to append our points to. Let's call it output. Next, let's create a loop through a list of numbers defined by the input. To do this, let's use a range function. So for x in range num, then within this loop, let's assign a point to the p variable with x as the x coordinate. To do this, let's use the point by coordinates method. Then let's use this to create a circle by center point and radius. We'll use the variable circle and then make a call to the circle class by center point radius using our point for the first parameter and 0.2 for the second. Then let's append this circle to the output list. And then when the for loop ends, let's return the output list. Great, so let's try that function by creating a variable named circleList, and we'll assign to it a call to our new function using 20 as the parameter. Then let's output circleList and hit run. You can see that we get an error, which is global name point is not defined. That's because on line 22, I've used point instead of p. So Python doesn't understand what the point word is. Let's replace that with p and hit run. Then let's zoom in on the points. Great, so it looks like we've built a function that creates an array of circles easily. One thing to keep in mind when working with functions is that when we pass an object into a function that is mutable, that is, it can be changed, such as a list, we need to keep in mind that if it changes in the function, it will update the list outside of the function. To demonstrate this, let's create a simple function which we'll name list change. And this function will take one parameter, let's call it LST. So all we want this function to do is simply change index 0 of the input list that we provide to the function, and then return the list. So let's add in LST index 0 equals 1, and then return LST. Now let's output circle list, and then a call to our new function, list change, using circle list as the parameter, and hit run. You'll see that both of the lists have been changed at index 0. This is because when we pass a changeable object, like a list, to a function, it is a reference. Any changes we make directly to the parameter will change the original list. One way you might get around this is by passing a copy of the list to the function. Creating functions allow us to create clear, concise scripts while saving time by writing chunks of code out only once.